So thanks everyone for joining. This is Jade Whitty with 30 Minutes with a Hacker. I'm a solutions practice consultant with Tech Data, and I've got on the line a number of people, but Brett Scott, as well as Josh Harp, are two ethical hackers that are in the trenches every day, sharing us their insights. And so today's topic is about GDPR and PIPEDA, however you want to pronounce it, CCPA, which is coming out soon. So just to kind of level set, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that's in effect now. It affects Europe, and we'll hear a lot about that. The PIPEDA, Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, and it's in effect now. That affects Canada. And then the CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act. That's going to be taking effect January 1st of 2020. So there's a lot around that right now. So when I hand this over to Josh, just to kind of give your take. I know you're an ethical hacker, and when we talk about this topic, I know it's not maybe the sexiest topic to talk about, but yeah, it's kind of some interesting points when we were talking yesterday. So I just want to hand it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. So, like Jade said, when I've thought about specific regulations and policies, I haven't specifically looked at how they could potentially be used against an organization in a malicious manner. And then just in conversation with Brett, and knowing as well an article you put out on your LinkedIn around the weaponization or the potential weaponization around GDPR, it's a very interesting topic. So first, what I would like for us to do, and I think what may occur is GDPR could take over the bulk of this conversation, but we'll probably hit on PIPEDA a little bit and then expand out on PIPEDA some more on another call. But just to level set where everyone is, Brett, could you give and explain like I'm five pitch on what GDPR is and what it means for organizations?
Certainly. Thank you, Josh. There's quite a lot of activity on privacy. In fact, there's actually legislation being knocked around in Congress as we speak, talking about a brand new GDPR for America. All of this centers on the topic of privacy. So for American businesses, when legal people and legislators start talking about privacy, really what they mean is almost something completely antithetical to American business. So American business is all about knowing your customer and getting and building profiles. Regardless of where you feel politically or whether or not people should be doing that, that's what's going on. Privacy is quite literally pushing back on all of that and maybe even trying to kill its ability. So GDPR is the first major bit of legislation that has impacted American businesses. Essentially, any European that has been using your systems, if you have data on them, they have the right to request of your company, what do you know about me? You must tell me everything you know, which is very difficult for businesses to produce anyway. But then if you can't do it in time, they can fine you for that. And then, of course, the additional part of GDPR is the right to be forgotten. They can say, well, forget everything you know about me. And as a direct result, you have to go back and delete all of that data, which, interestingly enough, also includes your backups. Good luck. So GDPR was one of the big shots across the bow. The Canadians have a big privacy law that it was poorly constructed called PIPEDA, but it too classifies things as personal information, things like IP addresses, which normally would not be considered a personal bit of data, is included. And then CCPA, that takes place in 2020. Think of it as GDPR for Californians. And then, of course, I'm pretty sure that Congress will go out and try to supersede that and make a national privacy policy. But generally speaking, companies are required to know what data is about a person and where it is. They need to be able to articulate it. They need to have a process around it. And there are other things around it. For example, you may have to justify, why do you have this data about people or your customers, et cetera? How long do you keep it? What's your process for removing it? And these regulatory bodies that enforce these things have the authority to actually talk to your staff. So if your staff are not trained and able to articulate what those things are, you also risk fines for that. And then, of course, if there's a breach, it just brings ever greater penalties down upon you.
So one of the things I'd like to do is as well give some numbers here. 61% of the UK businesses were ready for the enforcement of the General Data Protection Regulation, so GDPR. And then 34% of organizations have actually successfully completed a right to be forgotten request, so that RTBF that you were talking about. So, Brett, distributed denial of service attacks, DOS, RCEs, remote code execution, these types of vulnerabilities are familiar to a lot of us ethical hackers or just, security professionals out there. But can you talk about how specifically one might be able to weaponize a right to be forgotten request, or what type of impact that could have on an organization, or what other areas within GDPR could potentially be leveraged against an organization? So another form of exploitation, so to speak. So data privacy regulations ultimately being weaponized.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and thank you for that. When you are talking about systems from the hacker mindset, you simply say, okay, how is this thing designed? What's it intended to do? How do the pieces fit together? And then now from a hacker mindset, how can I use this as leverage or power either for or against the folks that are involved? So in the case of any one of those privacy regulations, GDPR, PIPEDA, CCPA, and forthcoming American version of GDPR, you have a situation where a company is required to respond to something when you submit a request. So my hacker mind initially goes straight to saturation. I could simply flood a victim company with massive numbers of requests from a body of folks, which could either be found through dumps or previous compromises, etc., and say, I am working on behalf of so-and-so, and I demand that you tell me everything that you know about my client, and then subsequently, I demand you forget everything you know about that client. So you can easily overrun what's largely a human effort in these businesses with poor tools. Most businesses that are in compliance, big air quotes on compliance, probably did that through superhuman effort. Well, you can't do that at scale. So that would be an easy saturation attack for me to cause you a great deal of problems. And of course, if you fail to meet things on time, I can then use the weapon of regulation and regulatory bodies to fine you. So I'm using both a saturation style attack, but also a resource denial attack, in that I am using a regulatory body to bleed out your cash and take money from you. Failure to comply with GDPR could result in 10% of your annual revenue as a fine. That's a substantial amount, which most businesses cannot sustain. So again, that's my initial set of thoughts, is how do I saturate these poor victim companies so that they can't survive? And then of course, then the next thing would be to put on my evil hat, right? The black hat, and say, okay, if I wanted to, I could go to any company that probably isn't very good at compliance, and I could say, hey, I'm about to do this to you, or you can just write me a big check and pay me in Bitcoin. And as a direct result, you have an extortion risk, because again, they could simply say, I can use this apparatus against you, all right? And then of course, most businesses will pay because they know that they can't possibly resist that fight. And then of course, then you also have a whole bunch of other potential permutations that center around that particular thought. Those would be the first things my mind goes to.
So some threat groups you mentioned, and sorry, was there a question? No. So
Go ahead, Josh. I'll ask it after you're done.
No worries. So some potential threat groups that I could think of, and you can fill in the blanks, would be cyber criminals, hacktivists, and cyber criminals is overarching, but sometimes that can play into state actors. But do you think that this could be something used by competitors or just generic run-of-the-mill privacy advocates or any individual outside of a state-sponsored realm? So, the weaponization of privacy policies or any privacy regulation for that matter, could it get into the state level area, or would it just specifically be smaller groups of adversaries? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I really like the thing that you mentioned, which is your competition. Why on earth wouldn't your competition go find, say, someone who claims to be a privacy advocate and say, hey, we really want to stick it to our competitor. We're going to pay you, on the down low, and what we want you to do is to go after our competitor with all of these requests. And by the way, here's a customer list of people we know do business with them. So here's your fast list to making, saturating my competitors. So I would say to you that the scale would trend upwards. In other words, whoever it is that has it in for you, they will try to scale themselves up to the highest level of potency. And it looks like, from the way that these laws are constructed, that should be fairly easy to do, to get someone who, even as an individual, to scale up to a very high level of effective force.
I know that you wrote an article about the saturation attack, angle, and that was, I don't know, several months ago. I remember reading it, and then I thought you had an interesting comment, the feedback that you got from others, and then what's recently happened. If you can comment on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that article was published a little over a year ago, and maybe even coming up on 2 years here. What was funny about that is, as someone who is part of all of our cybersecurity efforts, one of the things that happens when you're too far ahead of the crowd, you usually get berated. You say, oh, well, this could happen and that could happen. And several of the things that both Josh and I have mentioned actually did end up happening. But at the time the article was published, they said, oh, that's just silly and nobody would ever do that. But sadly, every one of those things has happened, and there have been many documented examples of each one of the things that we had warned people about actually occurring in real life. So, that's part of the role that we play, is to be ahead of the curve, so to advise our customers, which are you, the partner, so that you can then advise your customers on the stuff that's coming. And of course, that is something that no one else can deliver. So that gives us and you a unique position in the market.
So that leads perfectly into where I would like to go next, or talk about some of the things we've mentioned, Brett, when people have asked us about this. Is we always talk about how education is key, how knowing what data you have is important, and understanding how your data flows is crucial. So as the director of solutions development here at Tech Data, what would be some solutions you've encountered, or just specific additional measures that could be taken, or things that should be done within our partners and customers organization, and for the partners that will be listening to this phone call, things that they can start to either market to their end customers, or even they themselves should be thinking about for their own organization security? Just, what is the solution? Because there's not a silver bullet.
Yeah, I wish there was. That would be fantastic. One thing that, if you look at, sort of read the tea leaves of what the intent of all this legislation is, they very much want companies to get in touch, to get zen with the idea of privacy and where's my data and how am I protecting it. So if you look at it from that standpoint, the first thing that's going to be revealed is you probably don't have a documented policy. You don't have a set of procedures or SOPs to follow. And so because of that, one of the strongest things that we put into our lineup is recon policy. That allows companies to very quickly establish stuff from sort of pre-built materials. They can then use those materials, tailor them slightly, and then now you have something you can point to. So if a regulator shows up at your door and says, show me all of your policy and it relates to customer privacy, if you don't have an answer right now, you will get fined heavily for that. If you have a breach, you will get penalized heavily for not having that. So this is one way you could very quickly sort of blunt the spear of these regulators towards your company. And then, of course, beyond that, you also want to make sure that you not only have a formal policy, but you have an understanding of what's going on your network. That's where we add things into our lineup like Recon SOC. And of course, fundamentally, after all is said and done on all that, you need to understand specifically where you are and where you need to be making improvements. And this is where some of our free security posture assessments or other forms of assessments we do through Recon ProServe that will help you to get to all of those things. So we very much are not people just ringing a bell and saying you have an alarm. We also offer ways for you to answer these questions and preserve your business and your clientele.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about certain solutions. I know that there's Splunk has a solution, others that aren't even on our line card, but maybe talk about those in comparison to some that we have that can address some of these issues.
Yeah, there are lots of things and utilities and out there, and of course, everybody starts in a different spot, so the answer would be different based on ultimately the end customer. And of course, the answer is biased by what you, our customer or partner, has, because you're essentially going to have solutions you have on the shelf. Simply saying there's this thing out there, you should go find it, is not necessarily good for everybody. And of course, so we are in the process. Part of my job is to make sure that we have all the tools in the kit that we need. But one of the things that it will become more and more in demand is the ability to quickly figure out what you know about someone and where you have that data stored. One of the fastest ways you can do that is using a product called Fluency Security. That's actually on our line card, and that allows you to query the data sets you have from your security devices and other things very, very quickly. It stores the data as data, not as one giant text blob, so it's efficient, it's fast, it's able to do accurate searches of everything. So that's another tool that would help a company to very easily have the right tool to deal with these privacy requests. Beyond that, there are a number of things that you could do. You should be using a SIEM tool, security event and incident management tool. You should have an incident response capability. In other words, there is a threat or there are these attacks and we see them and we need to do something about them other than worry about them being a breach. So those are things that can be pursued, but I'm happy to get a little bit more direction from you, Jade, if you'd like to move me into any one of those, anything specific.
Well, when we were chatting yesterday, one of the things that I thought was interesting was that you can use a SIEM solution like a Splunk or different ones out there, lots of them out there, and they will give you similar information that Fluency Security will. However, the way that it's done is very cumbersome, and that's one of the features or the cool aspects of Fluency that I thought was interesting. Maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, in fact, that's really glad that you brought that up. So, not all security tools are the same, and right now, people that make SIEM tools are facing a specter. The Grim Reaper is on their shore, so to speak. What it means is that all of this data that's being produced by all these devices, and then of course, if you look at IoT, that just puts it on super steroids. There's too much data for these tools to ingest and deal with. And so they are very easily overrun and oversaturated. The problem for businesses, when the regulatory bodies show up, the fact that you have a tool that got saturated is not an excuse, will not prevent the fine, and therefore your tool, if it is not capable of dealing with the sheer volume of data, you're in trouble. So every one of those guys is spending every last shiny penny they have trying to get over that problem. Right now, there's only one company that succeeded, that's Fluency. But tools like Splunk, which also have extremely high volume capability, it's a very good tool. I actually had my first exposure to that with the federal government, assisting them with the project. I can tell you that they still store data in a blob. So it's sort of like trying to find how many ands somebody said in all the papers they've ever written. You can get the job done, but it's a really laborious effort taking a lot of time and energy to produce. When you store the data as data and not the blob, you can do the single query to say, hey, how many ands are in all the things that have happened, and very quickly get the answer to that, like seconds instead of weeks. And it's done with a single human being versus a team of people that are assembling all of this data. So, again, there are tools available like Splunk, like any of the other SIEM providers that are out there. But the problem is that that may, in and of itself, may not be the solution you need to prevent the risk of fines and saturation.
We talked a little bit about the fines. 10% of the annual revenue is the GDPR fine, which is substantial. Do you have any idea what the fines for PIPEDA or CCPA are in the works, are planning to be?
Yeah, PIPEDA will be, I think, tied up in court battles for probably the better part of a decade. Just the definition was bad, execution was bad. They have a privacy office. The office, up until last year, was not even able to articulate what specifically was meant by this law. So I expect that that will be somewhat neutralized. But again, it's only buying time from the reaper. It'll still come down on you. You still will be held accountable. So it's the fact that they don't have their stuff together is not okay for you to protect yourself. You need to get on top of that as quickly as possible. In the case of the CCPA, again, this takes place starting January 1st, 2020. You are going to be held liable for any people you have not trained on your specific policy, and their investigators can come into your office and say, okay, who's involved in this customer? And if that person, whoever, or people that they identify are not able to clearly articulate and have it match to what your specific declared and documented policy is, whether or not you did anything wrong, they can fine you for a lack of preparedness. And so the fines are intended to be severe. They want you to, as a business, to take everything very, very seriously. Your end customers are facing a new set of very powerful wolves, and they are potentially not prepared. So you as a partner have a very strong opportunity to help them understand that there is this problem, there are these wolves, and that they need to get on top of that. And I think, unfortunately, for most American businesses, most of your competition won't even really be bringing this up to them until it's way too late or to get the people trained in time or to get the policies down on paper. So again, these fines will be, they're intended to be a big flash in the pan. Think of it as justice trying to find an example. You don't want to be in the first wave of people that get caught, because when you do get caught, they're going to make an example of you, which means you're going to have a disproportionately punitive problem. So I would urge you to speak with your customers about getting ahead of this problem, and don't let it spring up on them. Otherwise, they're probably doomed.
So simply put, it's not soon, it's now, and it's not if, it's when.
That's a much better way to put that in 2 sentences.
Andrew, did you have a question? I saw you were off mute, but I didn't.
Yeah, I did, Jade, and I kind of brought to a point that Brett was talking about, of almost a distributed attack on a request for information. Kind of, and this isn't necessarily a direct question at Brett or Josh, but I don't know if anybody knows if there's a way that the company validates that the person requesting that information is that person, to where maybe you could even have data leakage because I stole Jade's information, requested information from that company, and Jade's information was sent to me, to where you almost have 2 issues now.
Well, and that's a good thought, and I like the way you're thinking. You're getting to be on a hacker mindset. But how I would counter that is, again, I would make an advocate. I could, even if I was trying to be, good about this, I could go to these parties and say, do you know what this company knows about you? We've heard they're tracking some very serious stuff. They might even know what you look like and when you're sleeping. We need to find out what this is, and I'd like your help. Will you give me authority to make this request on your behalf? I promise to pursue it to the very end. What person is going to say no to that? They're going to say, what? I don't want these guys to know about me. Oh, someone's going to do the work for me? Fantastic. Let them do that. So it's very possible that a single advocate could stir the pot with the customer base of your clients and make them angry. And then, of course, now all of that is directed back at you, your organization.
Very interesting. Brett, kind of to follow up to that, any theoretical approach of how to prevent that or defend against that?
So the easiest answer is simply be prepared. I guess I was a Boy Scout, but being prepared pretty much neutralizes every one of the nasty things that's there. Short of that, you're going to have to be prepared, but in a much different way. You're going to need to have a legal team that's ready to do challenges, may even want to file cases and say, look for injunctions and things like that. That's a fairly expensive route. The best possible answer is, don't let this thing spring up on you. Simply be prepared. Expect that it will happen to you. And when it does, you have mechanisms in place and you have opportunities to have optimized that process thereby reducing the cost to your organization.
I got
Thank you very much.
one last question. So the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, obviously is in California. Is it affecting areas outside of California? Maybe similar to GDPR. If you have if you're doing business in California, it affects you. Maybe that's the case. Are there any other states that you've heard of that are planning to do the same thing, or on a federal level? Have you heard anything along those lines?
Yeah, so there's definitely something happening at the federal level. So there were a bunch of states that got together and said, oh yeah, we got to do something like CCPA. And of course, all the tech companies are saying, whoa, we can't be dealing with 50 different independent regulatory bodies. It'll cost us too much money. And they have lobbyists. So they're going to Congress and saying, hey, you can supersede all of this state regulatory stuff if you pass a federal privacy law. So Congress doesn't do very much these days, but I can promise you this, they will do a privacy legislation that will pass and it will get signed.
Thanks, Brett and Josh, and everyone that was on the call. I appreciate it, and look forward to the next call with Brett and Josh a month from now. So everyone have a good rest of your day.